The canyon opened before him like an ancient wound, deep and raw, one the earth refused to close. Rust-colored rock walls rose beneath the pale sky, and the wind swept through the cliffs with a dry whisper, as if it carried secrets from a time long buried. Zeke Callahan rode slow along the edge of the gorge, his lone figure silhouetted against the flickering light of late afternoon. He wasn't looking for anything. Hadn't been for days. Days when the world seemed stripped down to dust, timber, and silence. But something felt different in the air that day. A faint noise, a broken breath, like some wounded creature still clinging to life. Zeke tightened the reins and listened close. It wasn't a coyote. Wasn't the wind either. He stepped down from his horse and moved forward with care, each footfall on the stone an act of faith. Then, rounding a ledge, he saw her. She was a woman. Or what was left of one. Pinned beneath a cracked slab of rock, her body caked in dust, face tilted skyward, eyes barely open. Her sun-bronzed skin bore that copper hue that spoke not just of desert sun, but of a different bloodline. Apache blood. But Zeke didn't think about that when he saw her. He only saw that she was still breathing. And that was enough. He crouched beside her without a word. His shadow fell over her like a blanket. Then, with a voice hoarse but steady, the woman raised her face and said something that chilled him to the bone. "Make it quick. I won't scream." Zeke froze, fingers halfway to the stone. Not from fear, not from surprise, but because, deep in his chest, he understood everything those 5 words carried. What kind of life a woman must have lived to stare death in the face and not flinch. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said finally, his voice low and contained. Her eyes narrowed. The wind held its breath, as if it, too, waited for her answer. Zeke braced his hands on the slab's edge and, with careful strength, began to shift it. The rock groaned and gave way. Her body tipped slightly to the side, freed but drained. Zeke caught her, feeling the faint, tense weight of her against his chest. She didn't fight it, but she didn't go limp either. It was like carrying a wounded doe, muscles taut, heart still wild. He carried her in his arms to his cabin, a modest shelter near the canyon's rim, built from old wood and hand-fitted stone. Inside, he laid her down on a straw mattress near the fire. The crackling logs gave off warmth that couldn't quite melt the frost of mistrust. She didn't speak, just watched him, unsettlingly calm, like someone studying whether the wolf had worn the shepherd's skin well. Zeke lit a lantern. His fingers, toughened by years of solitude and cattle work, trembled slightly as her face came into the light. There was dust on her cheeks, her lips were dry and cracked, but her eyes? Those eyes weren't the eyes of someone broken. They were obsidian arrows, steady, tired, yes, but still sharp enough to pierce a man's soul. He held out a cup of water. She took it without a word, both hands shaking. She drank slowly, like someone who didn't even trust the water. Then, she set it down on the floor, gently, like returning something she hadn't asked for. "I don't need your pity," she said at last, without looking at him. Zeke nodded. He didn't argue, just tossed another log into the fire. "I'm not offering pity," he replied, voice deep. "Just a place to breathe." She looked at him then, really looked, without weighing him. She said nothing more. But the silence between them changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a truce. Outside, the wind stirred again. Inside, the cabin breathed. 2 strangers sharing warmth. Not trust, not yet. But something, maybe the only thing that mattered, had begun. The fire still burned when night finally settled over the canyon. Outside, the stone walls whistled with the wind sliding down the cliffs, pushing the cold like a frozen tongue. Inside, Zeke Callahan moved slow, as if any sudden noise might shatter the fragile truce hanging in the air. The woman remained awake. She didn't sleep, though she sometimes shut her eyes as if pretending. Her body still bore the signs of exhaustion, but her senses were alert like a wounded she-wolf. Zeke had seen that look before, the readiness to flee, even with no strength left to run. He didn't press her with questions. He offered another cup of water, and this time, her hands were steadier. "Zeke," he said softly, not looking straight at her. "That's my name." She didn't answer, but something shifted in her gaze. It wasn't acceptance, wasn't trust, but it wasn't rejection either. She just heard it, like someone storing a fact away, for now, without promise. Long minutes passed in silence. Zeke stood up to check the firewood and poked at the flames with the tip of the iron. The crackling filled the room with a living murmur. She watched him from the cot. The movement of his shoulders, the way he leaned without turning to face her. He wasn't clumsy, nor threatening, more like someone who'd lived too long in the company of his own shadow. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly. The question fell like a pebble dropped into a deep well. Zeke looked at her at last. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a distant echo of pain. "Because leaving you there felt wrong," he answered simply. She frowned. That wasn't the answer she'd expected. It wasn't dramatic nor heroic, just true. And that made it harder to reject. She lay back down, finally closing her eyes, though her body still held tension. Zeke said nothing more. He sat in a wooden chair by the window. From there, he could see the canyon's edge, bathed in moonlight. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, and the echo bounced between the walls like a reminder. Out there, the world showed no mercy. Hours passed like that. At some point, she drifted off. And he did too, though with one eye open. When dawn touched the cabin with golden fingers, the dust floating in the air looked like tiny constellations in the light. Zeke was already awake. He always was before the sun. He lit the stove and brewed coffee. Not out of hospitality, but out of habit. The bitter scent mixed with the dry smell of sage bundles hanging near the door. Ada Redhawk, because now he knew that was her name, slowly pushed herself upright. The bandaged leg tightened, and a grimace crossed her face. But she made no sound. Zeke brought over a chair. "Sit down. I'll get something to eat." She obeyed, not as someone following orders, but as someone accepting a temporary truce. He set out a plate of warm atole, along with some dried berries he'd kept stored away. They ate in silence. Outside, the sun rose slowly, and its warmth began to push the shadows out of the canyon. When they'd finished, she spoke without looking at him. "I'm not good company." Zeke didn't reply right away. He took a slow sip of coffee, rested his arms on the table, and finally said, "I'm not good company either." There was no smile, but the air between them loosened slightly, like a rope that no longer pressed against the throat. A while later, Zeke stepped out onto the porch. The wind brought a smell he didn't like. Burnt, metallic. He lowered his eyes to the ground. Behind some stones, in the earth still damp from the night, he spotted tracks. Not cowboy boots. These were deeper, more deliberate, and came from the east. When he stepped back inside, Ada was already watching him with the same tension in her shoulders that he felt in his chest. "He's close," she said, before he could speak. Zeke didn't ask how she knew. He just nodded. In his world, Some instincts spoke louder than words. The canyon's silence wasn't empty. It held things, echoes of ancient footsteps, screams no one heard, and the broken breathing of those who had learned to survive more than to live. Zeke Callahan stood in the doorway of the cabin, eyes fixed on the tracks beside the porch. They weren't fresh, but not old either. Wide boot prints, deep, made by someone who knew where to step and when to move. This wasn't a lost traveler. It was someone coming with purpose. Inside, Ada Redhawk said nothing, but her eyes stayed on him. She'd lived long enough to know the signs in a man's shoulders when something was wrong. "Should I go?" she asked, voice flat, emotionless. Zeke looked at her, then out toward the horizon. A thread of wind lifted the dust, as if the earth itself was trying to erase the trail. "He's already been here," he said plainly. She frowned, shifted slightly in her chair, and glanced at her bandaged leg. "Did he hurt you?" Zeke showed his arm. A dry red scrape crossed his skin. Nothing serious, but real enough. "An arrow. Close call. Didn't hit clean." Ada turned her face away and pressed her lips together. The air inside the cabin thickened. Zeke felt it, like the fire in the stove had gone cold all at once. Without another word, she stood up. Still limping, but every step held a painful kind of resolve. She stepped outside and crouched beside the canyon wall, where dry plants clung to the stone. Her hands moved fast, gathering yarrow leaves, desert sage stems, and tiny white petal flowers. Zeke watched her from the doorway. There was something in her that refused to break, even when everything else had. He saw her crush the plants in her fingers, rubbing them hard until a thick juice came out. Then she walked toward him, saying nothing, and reached for his arm. Instinctively, he pulled back, not out of fear, but because of what it meant to allow that touch. She didn't flinch. She just waited. After a moment, Zeke lowered his gaze and held out his arm. The salve was warm, and Ada's fingers were firm, but careful. Her breath touched his skin, and Zeke held his own without knowing why. He'd faced armed men, freezing nights, and storms that tore roofs clean off. But none of that had ever unsettled him the way that silent touch did. "You saved my life," he murmured without thinking. Ada didn't look up. "You saved mine first." Zeke nodded. There was nothing more to say, and nothing less. When she finished wrapping his arm, she stepped back. He moved it gently, noticing the pain had eased a bit. He wanted to thank her, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he slipped on his jacket and walked toward the stable. "Come on," he said, not turning back. "You're not ready to walk far, but you can learn to ride." Ada frowned. "To run?" Zeke paused, turning his head slightly. "To choose." She didn't answer, but she followed him. Midnight, the black horse, snorted when he saw them. Tall, strong, with calm eyes. Zeke patted his flank with a steady hand. Ada stepped forward with quiet respect. She touched the horse's muzzle and whispered something in her own tongue, a soft word that seemed to cradle the air itself. Zeke watched the moment carefully. He helped her into the saddle, making sure not to touch her more than necessary. "Lean forward a bit. Let him feel your weight," he instructed. Midnight responded with an unexpected gentleness. They started along the creek that marked the canyon's entrance. The ground was softer there, and the air carried a distant scent of moisture. At one point, the horse stumbled slightly. Ada gripped the horn, and Zeke raised his hand to steady her. His fingers brushed her knee. They both froze. Less than a second, but enough. The touch sparked something buried and old. She took a deep breath. He cleared his throat. "You've got a knack for it," he said, regaining a neutral tone. She gave a faint smile, the first since she'd arrived. And with that, between dust, hoofprints, and fear, something else took root. Something that didn't yet have a name, but had already begun to exist. The afternoon drifted down slow across the canyon, and the wind began to shift. It wasn't just any breeze. It carried an old message, the kind that folks who've lived long enough learn to read without words, the kind of wind that curls between stones, that smells of iron and danger. And Ada knew it. She stood near the corral fence, eyes narrowed toward the horizon. Zeke watched her from the porch, coffee in hand, brow slightly furrowed. He didn't need to ask. He saw it in the way her shoulders stiffened, and how she pressed her lips together. "Something bothering you?" he asked at last. "Creedvoss is closer than you think," she said, never taking her eyes off the eastern hills. Zeke didn't answer right away. He glanced down at his own hand, where the bandage Ada had tied was starting to loosen. He tightened it gently, not for the pain, but for the clarity it brought. The danger wasn't some distant idea. It was real, and it was near. As the golden light of dusk painted the canyon walls, a rider appeared from the south, trailing a thin veil of dust behind him. Zeke recognized the figure instantly. Thorne Maddox, sheriff of Red Hollow Bluff, dismounted stiffly, like the ride had worn through to his soul. He held his hat in his hand, eyes lowered. Something in his face had changed. He wasn't bringing orders. He was bringing warnings. "Zeke," he said as he approached, "we need to talk." Ada had stepped outside the cabin. She stayed near the doorway, silent, one hand resting on the frame. She didn't need to hear the words to know what the talk was about. "Go on," Zeke said, not leaving his spot. Thorne stopped in front of him, dust still clinging to his skin. "The word's out. Folks are talking, Zeke. They say you're hiding someone. There's some planning to come for her tonight." Zeke didn't blink. "She hasn't harmed anyone." The sheriff ran a hand over his forehead. His fingers were caked with dry dirt. "That doesn't matter, and you know it. When people are scared, they don't listen to reason. And right now they're scared. They've got kids, livestock, old stories half told, and a hate that spreads like fire through dry grass." Zeke clenched his jaw, took a step forward. "So what are you going to do?" Thorne swallowed hard. "I'll stall them as long as I can, but they're coming, Zeke, and they're coming armed." Without another word, he turned, mounted back up, and vanished into the growing shadows stretched across the canyon. Zeke stayed still, his body taut like a rope on the verge of snapping. Ada approached quietly. The fire from inside the cabin cast her silhouette across the dust. Long, fragile, but steady. "You should let me go," she said softly. "If I stay, they'll come for you instead." Zeke didn't look at her. "I won't hand you over. Not to Voss, not to anyone else." Ada opened her mouth to reply, but Zeke raised a hand. He didn't need more words. His voice was stone and certainty. "I've seen what men like him do. I've seen what fear does to good towns." His eyes wandered to the distant outline of Red Hollow Bluff. And on his face, a sadness appeared, one that came from far back. No one deserves to be hunted just for surviving. She looked at him then, with a mix of disbelief and respect. Not because she doubted his words, but because she wasn't used to someone standing on her side without expecting something in return. In the distance, the sun finished hiding behind the cliffs, and the darkness began to creep along the ground like a promise. The fire burned soft inside the cabin as night wrapped the canyon like a heavy blanket. Every corner seemed to hold its breath, as if the world was bracing for something that hadn't yet shown its face. Ada Redhawk sat against the wall, her injured leg stretched out in front of her, wrapped in a strip of cloth now stained with dirt and dried blood. She didn't complain, or ask for anything. She simply watched. The fire. The wood. Zeke. He, in turn, moved between the stove, the door, and the table, his steps measured, never once letting her shape slip from his view. Something in the way Ada breathed, and how she kept her chin up despite the pain, stirred something deep inside him. When she tried to stand and wavered, he stepped toward her on instinct. "I don't need help," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. Zeke didn't argue. He only nodded, then quietly opened a small wooden box where he kept some clean bandages, a bottle of alcohol, and a pouch of herbs he'd gathered long ago, not knowing why at the time. "I need to change your bandage," he said in a calm, even tone. Ada didn't answer. She looked at him for a long second, weighing whether she could allow him that gesture. Then, without a word, she sat back down and lifted the leg of her trousers slightly, revealing the wound. Zeke knelt before her. The injury wasn't deep, but it was swollen. With steady, careful hands, he cleaned the area with alcohol, then began applying the crushed herbs. Ada clenched her jaw. The sting was sharp, but she didn't make a sound. She only looked down at his hands. How gentle they were, despite the roughness of his fingers. "You're not like the others," she murmured suddenly. Zeke didn't raise his eyes. "I don't know if that's good or bad." "It's just the truth." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It felt more like an unsigned truce, held together by steady breaths and the constant whisper of the fire. When he finished wrapping her leg, Zeke stood up. But something in his movement was slower than usual, like he wasn't ready to let the moment go. She noticed the difference, too. She lifted her eyes, and for a moment, their gazes met. There was no desire, no promises, just a silent truth. Neither of them was quite as alone as before. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. Zeke swallowed. He'd never been good with soft words, so he didn't respond with his voice. He responded with action. He took his coat from the peg and laid it folded beside Ada's cot. "Might help if the night turns colder," he said. A few minutes later, the two of them stood on the porch. Ada leaned on the walking stick Zeke had shaped for her from a juniper branch. They walked slowly, each step not just a movement, but something symbolic. When they reached the corral, the sky opened above them like an ocean of stars. Zeke brought out Midnight, the black horse, and stroked his flank gently. "It'll serve you well to know how to ride," he said. "Are you expecting me to leave?" "I'm expecting you to know how to choose." Ada stroked the horse's neck. Her fingers, for the first time in days, trembled without pain. It was a different kind of trembling, the kind that comes when the body finally begins to let go of tension that's been there too long. Zeke helped her up into the saddle. He didn't touch her more than necessary, just enough to steady her. He rode beside her, one hand firm on the reins. For a long while, the only sounds were the soft crunch of hooves on loose dirt and the whisper of wind in the cottonwoods. At one point, the horse stumbled slightly, and Ada gripped the horn. Zeke reacted instantly, reaching to steady her. His fingers brushed her knee, warm beneath the fabric. They both went still. It lasted only a second, half a breath, but long enough to know something had shifted. "You've got a natural balance," he said, slipping back behind his guard. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye. Then, without warning, she smiled. It was a faint smile, almost invisible. But to Zeke, it was like watching a flower bloom in the middle of the desert. The sun was fading behind the canyon walls, leaving behind a golden glow that hovered in the air, like it refused to die just yet. Zeke Callahan and Ada Redhawk walked back from the corral in silence, side by side at an easy pace. There was no rush. Neither had anywhere to be, and for the first time since she'd arrived, that didn't feel like a problem. The cabin welcomed them with warm light and the familiar scent of firewood. Zeke prepared a simple supper, some leftover cornbread, dried meat, and a bitter tea that helped settle the kind of silence they shared. They ate without saying much. But it wasn't the heavy silence that presses on the chest like a stone. It was a different kind now. A shared silence. Soft, like the kind old friends keep, where not every space needs filling. Later, Ada moved closer to the fire. She sat on the floor, legs crossed and back straight, and began to hum a tune so soft it barely reached the ears. Zeke looked up. He didn't recognize the song. It had no words, at least not in his tongue. It was an old melody, with that looping rhythm of things passed down without paper or ink. Like each note carried the memory of a face, a campfire, a night without a roof. He didn't say a word. Just watched her. Ada's hair fell over her shoulders like a soft shadow. Her eyes were closed, and her face held no pain, no tension. Only a focused calm Zeke had never seen in her before. The song ended, and the fire crackled as if in reply. Ada opened her eyes and saw Zeke watching her. For a moment she considered looking away. But she didn't. "Was it a prayer?" he asked softly. "No, it was a farewell," she answered. Zeke nodded, asking nothing more. He knew there were things a person doesn't explain. Only sings. "Did it bother you?" she asked. "No, I liked it." Ada lowered her gaze. Her fingers played with a loose thread from the blanket over her legs. "It was the song my mother used to sing when the fire went low. Before bed. Before we ran." Zeke shifted in his chair. Not from discomfort, but because something deep inside him, something without a name, recognized that kind of truth. And it hurt just the same. "Do you always remember it?" he asked. "No," Ada replied. "Only when I feel at home." Zeke didn't know what to say. He stood, walked over to the stove, and threw another log onto the fire. The flames rose, filling the cabin with flickering shadows. Ada watched him with an expression that mixed weariness and something else. As if her soul weighed less now. As if she was starting to understand that not all men lift stones to kill. "This isn't easy," she murmured. Zeke looked at her. "No, but you're doing just fine." Silence returned, but this time it felt like a nest, a safe place. Zeke sat down nearby, leaving space between them, but not too much. The fire burned in between, not just to warm, but to divide, to protect. Ada began to hum again, softer this time. It wasn't the same tune. This one was sweeter, almost childlike. Its notes rose and dissolved into the air like flower dust. Zeke closed his eyes for a moment. Somewhere inside him, something softened. And so, without realizing it, two strangers who had shared fear, wounds, and silence began to share music too. A promise without words, a beginning without a name. Red Hollow Bluff had always smelled like dry fear. Not the kind you scream, but the kind clenched between your teeth. The kind that crawls along the floorboards of the general store, slips through the cracks in the dust, and settles in the silence of folks who'd rather not look too long into a neighbor's eyes. That fear woke early the morning Creed Voss walked across the main street, hat low and face streaked with sweat and dirt. His horse, foaming at the flanks with a reddish sheen, looked as tired as its rider, but both kept their eyes fixed ahead. There was a dark line on Voss's cheek, maybe dried blood. Nobody asked. People stepped aside as he passed, not because they knew him, but because the way he moved left no doubt he was looking for something, or someone. He tied the horse beside the town hall trough and crossed the square without a word, leaving a trail of dust clinging to his boots. He walked straight into the sheriff's office without knocking, and when the door closed behind him, the voices inside vanished like they'd been swallowed whole. Thorne Maddox received him in silence. His eyes, weathered by years of uneasy peace, fixed on the visitor like a man bracing for a storm. "I'm looking for a woman," Voss said flatly. "An Apache. She survived an attack. She's on the run. Dangerous." Thorne didn't answer right away. He removed his hat, set it on the desk, and narrowed his eyes. "You sure she's still alive?" Voss's smile had no warmth. "Alive enough for me to track." He slapped a glove onto the desk, scattering small chunks of canyon dirt across the surface. "Her trail leads south, toward the canyon. Wouldn't surprise me if someone's hiding her." Thorne swallowed hard. He didn't name names, but his mind went straight to the one everyone avoided saying aloud. By midday, the rumor had spread like wildfire in a dry wind. What began as a whisper became a murmur, then sharpened into verbal daggers. "I saw him buying more supplies than usual. I swear I saw smoke rising from Blackthorn at dawn. Don't forget Zeke Callahan left the army. They said he went soft on Indians. That tells you everything. In the saloon, in the smithy, even in church, everyone had their version of the story, and everyone wanted to hear the one that scared them most. A small group of men began to gather outside the sheriff's office. Quiet voices at first, then louder, then more demanding. "We want answers, Maddox. You gonna act or not? If you won't move, we will." Thorne tried to calm them, promised to look into it, promised transparency. But fear had already taken hold of the conversation. Meanwhile, in Blackthorn Canyon, Ada felt the shift before Zeke did. She sensed it in the air, in the way the wind curved, in how the birds went still. "They're coming," she said, without looking back. Zeke looked out the window. He'd been carving wood in silence, trying not to think, but what he saw rattled him to the core. The horizon wasn't empty. Fresh tracks, still damp, marked the mouth of the canyon. He clenched his jaw and laid the knife down on the table. Last night's prints. They weren't from any rancher. Ada closed her eyes for a second. Her fingers trembled slightly atop the blanket. "You don't deserve this," she murmured. Zeke walked to the door. He stopped, but he didn't look back. "Maybe I do," he replied, "but that doesn't change what I'm going to do." And with that, he stepped across the threshold into a night that already smelled of gunpowder, horse-drawn dust, and choices that don't allow for turning back. Night fell over the canyon like a heavy shadow that left no room for doubt. This wasn't just any night. It was the kind with no stars, where even the wind blows lower, as if it knows not to raise its voice. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled in control. Ada Redhawk sat beside it, wrapped in a blanket Zeke had handed her hours before. She didn't speak, but her hands, though still, spoke for her. They trembled quietly, the way bodies do when they remember running. Zeke Callahan checked his revolver with practiced hands. It wasn't out of eagerness. It was necessity. Memory. The clarity of knowing what was on its way. Then came the sound. First, hooves, distant, then voices, and later, lanterns, small, furious lights descending the trail like angry fireflies. They didn't come hidden. They weren't looking to talk. They came to enforce. Zeke stood. He didn't grab the gun just yet. He only tightened the belt at his waist and walked toward the door. He opened it without hurry. The dust stirred up by the horses clung to the air like dry fog. In front of him, 20 men. Some with tilted hats, others with bandanas pulled up. All armed. At the front stood Thorne Maddox, the sheriff, face stern, shoulders slumped. Beside him, Flint Carver, an old rancher known for letting fear do his thinking. "Callahan," Flint said without ceremony. "We came for the woman. Hand her over and nobody gets hurt." Zeke didn't answer right away. He looked Flint in the eyes, then glanced at the others. One by one. Men from town, men he'd greeted at the market, crossed paths with at the river, seen in church. "No," he said finally. The word dropped like a stone into a well. Heavy. Final. A murmur passed through them. Some looked around. Others flexed their hands near their weapons. From the back, a voice rose. "She's dangerous. Let the law handle her." Zeke stepped forward. "The law?" he echoed, voice darker now, older. "The law executed unarmed families while I still wore its uniform." A sharp silence wrapped the group. No one talked about Zeke's military past, but there it was, laid bare like an open scar. "I won't make that mistake again," he added. "If you want her, you'll have to go through me." Several hands tightened around holsters. The lanterns flickered. For a moment, everything hovered an inch from disaster. Then the sheriff raised both hands. "That's enough," he shouted, voice raw. "No one's dying tonight." Thorne's eyes locked on Zeke. In them was something more than a plea. There was respect. Worn down, yes, but real. Eternal seconds passed. Then, like an invisible rope had snapped, the crowd began to break apart. Reluctantly, grumbling, with threats that faded like dust in the wind. When the last lantern vanished into the cliffs and only the sound of wind remained, Zeke didn't move. He stood still, breathing short, hands open. Ada stepped from the doorway. She walked slowly, her leg still aching, but her face calm. The fire behind her cast a golden halo around her frame. "You stood by me," she said, "when no one ever had before." Zeke turned his head. His eyes didn't search for praise or glory. "I did it because it was right." But Ada saw what he didn't say, what couldn't be spoken. For the first time since leaving the army, Zeke Callahan had chosen someone. And for the first time, when the echo of hooves faded into the night, silence covered the canyon. Not as a threat, but as a promise. The days passed with a quietness that once felt unreachable. The wind blew warmer now, lifting dust from the trails and carrying the scent of dry hay, earth, and almond blossoms blooming in the distance. Cole was returning from the field, his boots caked in mud, and his hands lined with tiny scratches. But that quiet half-smile always played on his face, the one that only appeared when he knew someone was waiting for him on the other side of the porch. Asha, seated on the wooden steps, was threading beads alongside Tiva, who had begun to mimic her every gesture. Mara sat nearby, weaving in silence, though her eyes followed her sister's every movement, as if she still couldn't quite believe they were all alive. And together. Since returning from the village, the ranch had stopped being just a place to pass through. That morning, the sky had opened in a clean blue hue. Cole was nailing down new planks on the barn while Asha hauled a bucket of water for the chickens. Their paths met halfway across the yard, like fate no longer had anything left to decide between them. As they passed, She looked at him with that expression of hers. Calm, but with a fire inside. "Did you get any sleep last night?" she asked, not accusing, only in that gentle tone she used when she was worried. "A little," he said, lowering his eyes, "though dreams sometimes look too much like the past." She didn't push. She just stayed there beside him, letting closeness say what words couldn't reach. That afternoon, while preparing lunch, Asha accidentally dropped a clay cup. The sharp sound cracked the kitchen's stillness. Cole, who'd been chopping firewood outside, came in right away. Seeing her crouched to pick up the shards, he knelt beside her, and without saying a word, his hand brushed hers. A brief touch, almost clumsy, but enough for them both to feel that familiar knot in the chest, the one that reminded them there was still fear, yes, but also something new beginning to take root. "You don't have to do it all on your own," he murmured. "And neither do you," she replied, looking him square in the eye. It was then that the silhouette of a woman on horseback appeared on the horizon. Mara was the first to rise, expression caught between surprise and suspicion, but Asha had already recognized that figure. That way of riding like clouds had no weight. It was Naya, her younger sister. When she arrived, she dismounted without a word. Her clothes carried the dust of the road, her braid had come loose, and her face bore more years than she had lived. But when she saw Asha, she broke. She hugged her with a force that was almost desperate, as if she needed to be sure it wasn't a mirage. Tiva watched the scene with curiosity from the doorway, clutching the hem of Mara's skirt. "I thought you were gone forever," Naya whispered, voice trembling. "I almost was," Asha replied, "but someone taught me that staying is its own way of fighting." Later that night, the three sisters sat by the fire. They didn't speak much, but between them, that wasn't needed. Asha's hands reached for theirs from time to time, like someone returning to touch a sacred stone they don't ever want to lose. Cole stood in the doorway, watching them in silence. He didn't want to interrupt that moment. It wasn't his. But when Asha looked up and gave him a soft gesture to join them, he understood that maybe, just maybe, he was part of it after all. He sat beside her, and she covered his hand with hers. Warm, steady. Tiva had fallen asleep across her lap. Mara was softly reciting an old song. Naya was tracing the beads of their mother's necklace, still resting around Asha's neck. There were no promises, no grand words, just glances, and the quiet certainty that, beneath that wooden roof and starlit sky, something new was taking root. A home doesn't always begin with walls. Sometimes it begins with the choices you repeat every day, to stay, to listen, to care. And on that quiet night, with the world still full of wounds that needed healing, Asha and Cole chose to stay. Once more. Dawn arrived slowly, without hurry, as if it knew there was no need to rush anymore. Down in the canyon, light slid along the stone walls, washing everything in a soft golden hue, not one that burned, but one that caressed. It was one of those mornings that didn't bring danger, or running, or farewells. Just existence. And for Zeke Callahan, that was already enough. He was sitting on the porch, back leaning against one of the wooden posts, hat resting on his knees, eyes half closed. In his hands, a mug of lukewarm coffee. On his face, the kind of peace you don't buy. You earn it, scar by scar. Ada Redhawk stepped out of the cabin with slow steps. She still had a slight limp, but no longer seemed to carry the past with every footfall. Her hair was down, caught in the breeze, and her eyes looked clear, as if she'd finally slept, really slept, for the first time in years. "It's warm," she said, like someone who didn't need to say anything else. Zeke nodded. He offered her the cup, and she accepted it without fuss. They shared the silence for a long while, watching the sky. Birds had begun to stir in the low trees, and the sound of water trickling through the hollow was almost music. "You can leave whenever you want," he said at last. She looked at him, not surprised, but with the quiet understanding of someone who'd already made that choice long before anyone gave her permission. "I know." They stayed that way, together without touching, both knowing that any movement might mean more or less. But sometimes respect is measured by the space you choose not to cross. Zach rose to his feet. He walked to a large stone at the edge of the trail, leading down into the valley, and with effort lifted it. Beneath it lay something buried, a small wooden box, weathered by dust and time. He opened it and pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper. "I wrote this years ago," he murmured, "back when I thought I'd never meet someone worth listening." Ada took the page gently. She read it in silence. Just a few words, scrawled in shaky ink. "If I ever find someone who doesn't look at me with fear, then maybe I'll stay." She folded the note again and handed it back without a word. Zeke looked up at her, and for the first time in a long while, he smiled. It wasn't wide or sure of itself. It was faint, rough, but real. "I guess it's time to build something more than just silence," he said. "Do you know how to build things?" she asked, raising one eyebrow. "With time, and with someone who's not afraid of broken foundations." Ada didn't answer right away. She just looked down at the ground, where, between the cracks in the stone, a wildflower had bloomed overnight. Small, alone, persistent. "Then yes," she finally said. "I'll stay." And with that, no hugs were needed, no kisses, no promises spoken aloud. Just the shared certainty that staying was, at last, braver than running. Days later, they were seen working side by side in the corral, repairing the fence that had leaned crooked for years. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. But the rhythm of their hands, the quiet passing between cabin and field, showed something new, a way of being that didn't need explaining. They never told anyone what happened on the night of the lanterns, or how Creed Voss vanished without a trace. Some say he rode north, beaten. Others say he never made it out of the canyon, but Zeke and Ada never spoke of it. Because some things aren't told, they're buried, like letters already read, like wounds that no longer ache. As another evening fell and the sun dipped behind the hills, Ada sat by the fire, just like that first night. She hummed an old tune, not a song of farewell. This time, it was a song of planting. Zeke listened from the doorway, hands covered in dirt and sawdust. He didn't say a word, but in his chest, something began to bloom. And now this story turns to you and asks, would you dare to stay, right when everything inside you says to run? Because sometimes, staying is the bravest act of all. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to walk with us through more true stories of the Old West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God gave to those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave us your thoughts in the comments, and join us again as we journey through this untamed land. Thank you.